They found his name carved into a slab of limestone, reused as a step in a theatre, face down in the dirt for 19 centuries. Pontius Pilate, the man who signed the order. And if you grew up in a pew, you already know how his story is supposed to end. You've heard it in a hushed voice at some point, the way these things get passed along. That he went mad, that he took his own life, that the earth itself refused his body, that the water spat him back out, that God's judgment came for every man who put Jesus on that cross and came for them hard. You were handed a story of divine vengeance, blood for blood, the killers of Christ hunted down one by the wrath of heaven. Here is the thing almost nobody tells you. That story is not in the Bible. It is not in Josephus. It is not in any Roman record. It was wished into being, centuries later, by people who could not bear the alternative, and the alternative is stranger, quieter, and in its own way far more disturbing than any curse. Because the truth about what happened to these three men is written down, in a first-century historian who had no reason to protect them, in an inscription pulled out of the sand in 1961, in a bone box dug out of a Jerusalem hillside in 1990, and what that evidence says is not that they died screaming under the hand of God. It's something the pews were never told, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. If you want to walk through this with me, all the way to the end, subscribe and turn on notifications so the next part of this story finds you when it's ready. And leave a comment, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I always read them. So let us go back to the beginning and separate what really happened from what we only wish had. Part 1. The version you were handed. Start with what you already carry, because you carry something. Almost everyone raised in the faith does. There's a folk memory, passed down in sermons and Sunday school asides, and the kind of story an older relative tells you once and you never forget, that the men responsible for the death of Jesus met terrible ends. Pilate killed himself. Herod was eaten alive by worms. The high priest was struck down. Each of them, in the telling, gets exactly what a righteous universe owes them. It's satisfying. It closes the circle. The innocent was condemned, and then the condemners were condemned in turn, and the ledger balances. And here's what I want you to notice about that story before we touch a single fact. It is emotionally perfect and historically unsourced. Nobody who tells it can tell you where it comes from. It has no chapter and verse, because it isn't scripture. It has no page in Josephus, because he never wrote it. It floats. It's the version you absorbed without ever being shown the receipt. The real records exist. They're not hidden in some Vatican vault. They've been sitting in plain sight for centuries, in the works of a Jewish historian named Flavius Josephus, in a line from the Roman writer Tacitus, in the archaeology of Jerusalem and Caesarea. And when you actually read them, something uncomfortable happens. The thunderous divine punishments dissolve. What's left in their place is a set of endings so ordinary, so bureaucratic, that you start to understand why later generations felt they had to invent something better. Because a God of justice demands a dramatic third act. History gave these men a much colder one. It gave them paperwork. It gave them a recall notice, a deposition, an exile order, and then it gave them the thing that should disturb you most of all. Silence, let me show you. Part 2. The stone they found in the theatre. In June of 1961, an Italian archaeological team was working the ruins of Caesarea Maritima, the great Roman harbour city Herod built on the coast of Judea. They were excavating a theatre, and they turned over a block of limestone that had been cut down and reused as a humble step, its inscribed face worn by generations of feet. There was writing on it, Latin, damaged, broken at the edges, but readable enough. It named a building, a Tiberium, something dedicated to the Emperor Tiberius, and it named the man who dedicated it. Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. Sit with why that matters. For centuries, skeptics could wave Pilate away as a character in a religious story, a name in a gospel, someone the church needed but history couldn't confirm. And then a spade turns over a paving stone, and there he is, not in scripture, but in stone, in his own province, in his own lifetime, with his own title. History confirms the man. He was real. He held the office. The Gospels didn't invent him. This is the discipline I want to hold to for the whole of this, so hear it now. When I tell you something is solid, I'll show you the stone it's carved in. When I tell you something is legend, I'll tell you plainly that it's legend, and roughly when somebody dreamed it up. I'm not here to take the mystery away from you. I'm here to make sure the mystery is real. And Pilate is confirmed one more way, from a source with no love for Christians at all. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing his annals around the year 116, records almost in passing that the founder of the Christian sect Christus had been executed during the reign of Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate. A Roman aristocrat, no friend of the faith, mentioning the execution as a matter of dry record, outside the Bible entirely. It happened. Pilate did it. So the man is real, the office is real, the execution is real, which means the question of what became of him afterward is a real question too, not a legend to be enjoyed, but a fact to be found. And the finding begins on a mountain with a crowd and a promise about something buried. Part 3. The mountain, the swords, and the complaint. Everything that ends Pilate's career begins with a rumour about treasure that was never there. The year is around 36. Our source now is Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, and this is bedrock history, the kind you can cite by section. A Samaritan man, a demagogue, tells his people that he can show them sacred vessels that Moses himself buried on Mount Gerizim, the most holy mountain in all the world to the Samaritans. It's the promise of a lifetime. Proof, treasure, the sacred past made suddenly touchable. And they come, armed, in a crowd climbing toward a village on the slope called Tetrarch. Pilate sees an armed multitude massing on a mountain and does the only thing a Roman prefect ever does with an armed multitude. He crushes it. He blocks the roads with cavalry and foot soldiers. Some of the Samaritans are killed outright. Others scatter. The leaders he takes prisoner, and then he has the principal ones put to death. There were no vessels. There was no treasure. Moses had buried nothing on that mountain. What Pilate had done was slaughter a crowd of religious pilgrims, chasing a lie somebody else told them, and this time it cost him. Because the Samaritans did something. They went over his head. They took their complaint to the one man above Pilate in the whole eastern half of the empire, Lucius Vitellius, the Roman governor of Syria. And they made a careful argument. We didn't gather to rebel, they said. We gathered to get away from this man's cruelty. We were the victims here, not the rebels. And Vitellius listened. He sent a subordinate named Marcellus to take charge of Judea, and he ordered Pilate to Rome to stand before the Emperor Tiberius and answer for what he'd done. That's it. That's the fall. Not a lightning bolt. Not a plague. A complaint filed by the right people to the right official, and a career ending in an administrative summons. The man who condemned Jesus was himself, in the end, condemned by a memo. But here's where it turns. Here's the detail that should stop you. Because what happened after that summons is where history quietly closes the door. Part 4. The Road to Rome and the Door that Closed. Josephus gives us one more line about Pilate, and it's a strange, almost novelistic one. He tells us that Pilate, after 10 years governing Judea, hurried to Rome to obey the summons, but before he could reach the city, Tiberius was dead. Think about the timing of that. Tiberius died in March of the year 37. Pilate is on the road, rehearsing his defense, hurrying toward a judgment before an emperor, and the emperor he's hurrying toward stops breathing before he arrives. The trial he was summoned for evaporates. The man who was going to judge him is gone. And then, nothing. I want you to feel the shape of that nothing, because it is the single most important fact in the whole story of Pontius Pilate, and it is the one nobody wants. Josephus, our best, our only real source for these events, simply stops. He does not tell us whether Pilate was tried by the new emperor. He does not tell us whether Pilate was pardoned, exiled, promoted, forgotten. He does not tell us how Pilate died, or when, or where. The man walks off the page in the year 37, and the reliable historical record never picks him up again. That is the truth the legends were built to cover. Not a punishment. An absence. The most infamous administrator in Christian history exits into total silence, and every dramatic ending you've ever heard for him, the suicide, the exile, the demon-haunted corpse, is somebody somewhere. Centuries later, refusing to accept that silence and painting over it with something they could live with, here's the question that should be burning now. If history goes dark in the year 37, then where did all the vivid deaths come from? Who lit the first candle in that darkness, and what did they need it to show? The answer has a name, and a date, and a motive. Part 5. The death Eusebius needed. The first man to give Pilate a dramatic ending was a bishop writing almost 300 years after Pilate vanished. His name was Eusebius of Caesarea, the same coastal city where they'd one day dig up the Pilate Stone. Around the 320s, Eusebius wrote the first great history of the church, and in the second book of it he tells us that Pilate, under the emperor Caligula, fell into such misfortune that he was driven to become his own murderer, to take his own life by his own hand, and Eusebius adds a line that tells you exactly what the story is for, that divine vengeance, he says, was not long in following. There it is, the oldest version of the punishment. And notice 3 things about it, because they matter. First, it comes 3 centuries late. This is not a memory. Nobody who knew Pilate is alive to correct it. Second, Eusebius does not tell us where he got it. He gestures vaguely at earlier writers, at Greek historians who recorded the games and the Olympiads, but he names no one, and no surviving Greek record contains the story. Even the scholars who translate Eusebius admit, in the footnotes, that the source cannot be found. It hangs on nothing. And third, this is the part that should make the hair stand up, Eusebius tells you his own agenda in the very same breath. Divine vengeance was not long in overtaking him. He isn't reporting a fact he stumbled on. He's completing a moral pattern. The man who killed Christ must have been destroyed by God, and so the destruction is supplied, and the supply is dressed as history. This is how it works. This is how the whole tradition of the terrible deaths gets built. Not by lying exactly, by needing, by a devout imagination that cannot tolerate an unpunished villain and so reaches into the silence and pulls out a suicide. Eusebius lit the candle. And once it was lit, others could not stop adding to the fire, until Pilate's death became one of the strangest legends in all of medieval Europe. A legend about a mountain, and a lake that would not keep him. Part 6. The lake that would not keep him. By the Middle Ages, the simple suicide had grown into something out of a nightmare, and I want to tell it to you the way they told it, but I need you to hold on to my hand here, because this next part is legend, top to bottom. It is not history, it is what the medieval imagination did with the silence. And it is magnificent, and it is chilling, and not one word of it is true. That's exactly why it's worth hearing. There's a late medieval Latin text scholars call the Mors Pilati, the death of Pilate. In it, Pilate is condemned by the emperor and takes his own life. And then the story turns to his body, because a body is a problem. You cannot simply bury the man who killed the Son of God. The earth won't have him. So they throw his corpse into the Tiber, the river that runs through Rome. And the waters revolt. Evil spirits swarm to the body, and the river churns and storms and floods, thrashing so violently that the Romans cannot bear it. They fish him out. They carry him north and sink him in the Rene at Vienne in Gaul, and the Rene rejects him too, the same demonic turbulence, the same unbearable disturbance. They move him again to a lake near Lausanne, rejected again, and at last they carry the accursed body high into the Alps and drop it into a black, lonely tarn on a mountain above Lucerne, in Switzerland, a pool ringed by cliffs, far from any town, where the spirits can rage without troubling the living. And that mountain, they say, is why it bears the name it bears to this day. Mount Pilatus. The Mountain of Pilate. Locals told stories for centuries that on certain days you could see his ghost rise from the water. That disturbing the lake would bring down storms on the whole region, that his restless corpse still lay at the bottom, unquiet, unwanted by the earth and the water alike. Now, the safe part, the true part, the part I promised you, it's almost certainly a folk etymology. The name Pilatus most likely comes from a completely ordinary Latin word, pileatus, meaning capped, because the mountain wears a cap of cloud, a weather word, a shepherd's word, and somebody, somewhere, heard Pilatus and heard the name of the man who killed Christ, and a legend crystallized around a coincidence of syllables. That's all it ever was, a mountain named for its clouds, and a civilization that could not stop dreaming about the corpse of Pilate. But if you think that's the strangest thing devotion ever did with this man, wait, because at the very same time half of Christendom was drowning Pilate over and over in demon-haunted water, the other half was lighting candles to him as a saint. Part 7. The Saint Named Pilate. I need you to prepare yourself for this one, because it upends everything the first 6 parts set up. Everything we've traced so far assumes one thing, that Christian tradition wanted Pilate punished, that the entire engine driving these legends was the need to see him suffer. And that's true for the Latin West, for the tradition you and I inherited. But travel south, go to Egypt, to Ethiopia, to the ancient Coptic and Ethiopian Orthodox churches, some of the oldest continuous Christian communities on earth, older than most of the traditions you grew up with, and ask them about Pontius Pilate. They will tell you he is a saint. Not a villain. A saint. In the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, Pilate and his wife are venerated, honoured with a feast day, the 25th of June. In these churches, the story went the opposite direction entirely, that Pilate came to believe that he was in some sense a secret witness to Christ, that the man who washed his hands in Jerusalem was not the enemy of the faith but an early reluctant convert to it. His wife, the woman Matthew's Gospel says was troubled by a dream, is honoured as a saint in more than one Eastern tradition. Stop and look at what you're seeing. The very same historical figure, the very same silence after the year 37, and out of that one silence, 2 churches built 2 opposite men. One drowned him forever in a haunted mountain lake. The other put his name in the calendar of saints. One needed him damned, the other needed him redeemed. And history, the actual record, said nothing to either of them. It just left the door open, and each tradition walked through it, carrying exactly what it already believed. That's the whole secret of the terrible deaths laid bare in a single man. These endings were never memories, they were mirrors. Tell me how a community felt about Pilate, and I'll tell you how they said he died. The wrath, the redemption, the haunted lake, the sainthood, all of it grew in the empty space where the facts ran out. And what grew there for Pilate grew for the others too. Which brings us to the man who arguably had more to do with the trial than Pilate ever did. The man in the priestly robes. The one who, unlike Pilate, we can lead you to, because we have found his bones. Part 8. The man who sat in judgment. Before there was a Roman verdict, there was a religious one. And the man who presided over it was the high priest, Joseph, called Caiaphas. Let me tell you who he actually was, because the Gospels give you a robe and a role but not a career, and the career is the tell. Caiaphas was appointed high priest around the year 18 by the Roman prefect Valerius Gratus, Pilate's predecessor, and he held that office until around the year 36. Do the arithmetic on that. Roughly 18 years. If you know anything about the high priesthood in this period, that number should make you sit up, because high priests in Roman Judea did not last. Rome appointed them, Rome removed them, and they cycled through the office in a year or two, discarded the moment they became inconvenient. Caiaphas lasted 18 years. He outlasted prefect after prefect. He survived every political storm that swept lesser priests out the door. That doesn't happen by accident. That is not the record of a hothead or a fanatic. That is the record of a supremely skilled political operator, a man who understood exactly how much to give Rome and exactly how much to hold back, who kept the delicate machinery of temple and empire running through year after dangerous year without letting it explode. When you read John's Gospel, and you hear Caiaphas say it is better for one man to die than for the whole nation to perish, you are not hearing a cartoon villain. You are hearing the cold, functional calculus of a man whose entire long career was built on managing exactly that kind of risk. So here is a man at the height of his powers, 18 years in the most dangerous religious office in the world, and still standing. The obvious question, the one you're supposed to ask, is how a man like that finally falls. What ends an 18-year survivor? And the answer is almost funny, because it's the same answer as Pilate's. The same hand that removed the prefect reached out and removed the priest, in the very same season. Let me show you. Part 9. The same hand that removed Pilate. Remember the name Vitellius, Lucius Vitellius, the Roman governor of Syria, the man the Samaritans complained to. The man who ordered Pilate to Rome. Hold that name, because he isn't done. Around the year 36, the same Vitellius comes down to Jerusalem, and Josephus tells us he came at Passover, and that he came to conciliate the Jewish population, to smooth things over, to be gracious, to make the empire look generous after the ugliness of the Pilate years. And part of that gesture, that political smoothing, was a personnel decision. He removed Caiaphas from the high priesthood and replaced him with another man, Jonathan, the son of the former high priest Annas. That's the end of Caiaphas's career. Right there. Deposed, not for a crime, not in disgrace exactly, but as a piece of imperial house cleaning, a gift handed to the crowd by a Roman governor tidying up after his subordinate. The 18-year survivor of the temple was removed the same way you'd remove a manager whose branch had drawn too many complaints. Pilate and Caiaphas, the two faces of the trial, the Roman and the priest, swept out of office in the same year, by the same man, for essentially the same reason. The province had become embarrassing, and Vitellius cleaned house. And now, you already know what's coming, don't you, because you've learnt the pattern. After that, Josephus tells us nothing. The high priest who tried Jesus is deposed around the year 36, and then he simply disappears from the record. We are not told what became of him. We don't know how he died, or when, or where. No trial, no punishment, no divine judgment, no plague, no worms. The sources are utterly stubbornly silent. He walks off the page exactly the way Pilate did, into nothing, except, and this is where Caiaphas gives us something Pilate never will, the silence in the written record is not quite the end of him. Because in 1990, entirely by accident, we may have found the man himself, not a legend about him, not a story. Him, his bones, in a box, with his name on the side. Part 10. The Bone Box in the Peace Forest. In November of 1990, workers were building a park south of Jerusalem's Old City, in a place called the Peace Forest, in a neighbourhood on the edge of North Talpiot. A construction machine broke through the ground, and opened a hole into the darkness of a 2,000-year-old burial cave. They called in the archaeologists. A man named Zvi Greenhut, from the Israel Antiquities Authority, went down into that cave, and what he found was a Second Temple period tomb, the kind of family burial cave a wealthy Jerusalem household would have used in exactly the era we've been talking about. Inside were 12 ossuaries, bone boxes. In that period, Jewish families would let a body rest in the tomb for a year until only the bones remained, and then gather those bones into a limestone box and set it in the wall, a final, intimate act of burial. Most of the boxes were plain, but one was extraordinary, beautifully, elaborately carved. Its surface worked with delicate rosette patterns. The box of someone who mattered, and scratched into it, twice in Aramaic, was a name, Yehoseph bar Caiaphas, Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Inside that ornate box were human bones, the commingled remains of 6 people, the way family boxes often were. 2 infants, 2 young boys, an adult woman, and a man who had died at around 60 years of age, a man of about 60, named Joseph of the family Caiaphas, buried in a wealthy tomb in Jerusalem in exactly the right period. And to date the tomb they didn't have to guess. Inside it they found a coin, minted under King Herod Agrippa I, dated to the year 42 or 43. The burial belongs to precisely the generation we're tracing. Now I have to be honest with you, the way I promised I would be, because the next question is the real one, and the scholars themselves are divided on it. Is this the Caiaphas, the high priest who tried Jesus? Or is it another Joseph, from the same well-known priestly family? Because here is where solid archaeology meets genuine, unresolved debate. And that debate is worth your attention. It's the difference between what we know and what we merely hope. Part 11. Is it really him? Here's the case for, and it's strong. The name is right, Joseph of the Caiaphas family, exactly the double name Josephus uses for the high priest, Joseph who was called Caiaphas. The date is right, a tomb sealed in the 40s, 1 generation after the trial. The status is right, an ornate, expensive ossuary in a fine Jerusalem tomb. The burial of a family of real standing. And the age is right, a man of about 60, which fits a priest appointed around the year 18 and deposed around 36 perfectly well. 4 independent things all point the same direction. And here's the case for caution, argued by serious scholars who aren't trying to spoil anyone's wonder. The epigrapher Ronnie Reich, who published the inscriptions, pointed out something careful. Son of Caiaphas might not mean Joseph's literal father was named Caiaphas. Caiaphas could be a family name, a clan nickname passed down, meaning the box could belong to any Joseph of that priestly line, not necessarily the famous one. The Cambridge scholar William Horbury argued much the same, that Caiaphas here functions as a family name rather than a strict father-to-son patronymic. Others noted the informal, almost casual quality of the scratched letters, and the absence of any high priestly title on the box. No high priest, no honorific, just a name. Would the most powerful priest of his generation really be laid to rest with nothing but a scratched name? So we sit in the honest place, the place the evidence actually puts us. This is very probably the tomb of the high priest Caiaphas's family, and it may well hold the man himself. But very probably is not certainly, and anyone who tells you it's a closed case is selling you more confidence than the stones will bear. But the case got stronger in a way almost nobody knows about. In 2011, Israeli scholars authenticated another ossuary, this one recovered from looters, so it took real forensic work to prove it genuine. And its inscription named a woman, Miriam, daughter of Yeshua, son of Caiaphas, and it went further, tying the family to a specific priestly division, the course of Marziah. It was the first time the Caiaphas name had ever turned up outside that one tomb, independent confirmation that this was a real, named, traceable priestly dynasty of exactly the period the Gospels describe. History, quietly, confirming the family tree. And that's where Caiaphas leaves us. Not with a thunderbolt. With a bone box, a real debate, and a name scratched twice in Aramaic. that may be the closest we will ever physically stand to any man who sat in judgment that night. No terrible death, no divine wrath, just a man of 60 gathered by his family into a beautiful box and set gently in the wall of a tomb. Which brings us to the third man, the one who actually got the ending closest to a punishment, though not the one the legends imagine. Part 12. The Tetrarch who wanted a crown. There were 2 Herods in the life of Jesus, and people confuse them constantly, so let me set this one clearly in front of you. The Herod of the Nativity, the one who slaughtered the infants of Bethlehem, was Herod the Great, and he was long dead by the time of the crucifixion. The Herod of the Passion, the one who appears at the trial, is his son, Herod Antipas, Tetrarch of Galilee and Perea, and he'd been ruling those lands since he was a young man, for over 30 years. You already know him, even if you don't know his name, because he did 2 things Scripture never lets you forget. He is the one who executed John the Baptist. Josephus confirms it independently. Outside the Gospels entirely, he tells us Antipas had John put to death, and he even tells us where, at the grim desert fortress of Machaerus, east of the Dead Sea. And Antipas is the one Luke's Gospel places in the Passion, when Pilate, learning Jesus is a Galilean, sends the prisoner over to the Galilean ruler. And Antipas, Luke says, had long wanted to see Jesus, hoping to see him work a wonder, and got only silence for his trouble. So here is a man who had John the Baptist beheaded and who mocked Jesus on the morning of the crucifixion. If the divine wrath theory of history were true anywhere, you'd expect it to be true here. This is the prime candidate. This is the man the story most wants to see destroyed, and what actually destroyed him wasn't God, it was ambition, his and his wife's. Because Antipas made one fatal miscalculation late in life, he reached for a crown he was never going to be allowed to hold. And the reaching is what finished him. Let me tell you how a 30-year reign ended in a single disastrous trip. Part 13. The wife, the crown, and the exile. The trigger was jealousy inside the family. Antipas had a nephew, Herod Agrippa, a charming, spendthrift, well-connected man who had spent years cultivating friendships at the very top of Roman society. And in the year 37, Agrippa's gamble paid off spectacularly. His friend Caligula became emperor, and Caligula gave Agrippa a kingdom. And with it the title Antipas had never had. King, Antipas was only a tetrarch, a ruler of a quarter, a lesser rank. And now his own nephew, younger, flashier, was a king. And according to Josephus, it was Antipas's wife Herodias, the same Herodias whose marriage had cost John the Baptist his head, who could not stand it. She pushed her husband. Go to Rome, she told him. Go to Caligula yourself and demand the royal title. Why should the nephew wear a crown while the uncle rules a quarter? So the old tetrarch and his wife sailed for Rome to ask the emperor to make him a king, and Agrippa, the nephew, saw them coming. He sent a messenger racing ahead with letters, with charges. He accused Antipas of conspiracy, of disloyalty, and specifically of stockpiling weapons, armour, Agrippa claimed, for 70,000 men. When Antipas arrived and stood before Caligula, the emperor put the accusation to him directly. Had he stored up all that armour? And Antipas admitted it. The armour was real. Whatever his reason, he could not deny the arsenal, and to a paranoid young emperor. An arsenal for 70,000 men in the hands of a tetrarch angling for a crown was all the answer required. Caligula did not have him killed. He did something quieter, and in its way, more complete. In the summer of the year 39, he stripped Antipas of everything. His tetrarchy, his wealth, his possessions, all of it handed over to the nephew, to Agrippa. And he sentenced the old ruler to permanent banishment. Exile, for life, to the far western edge of the empire, more than 1,000 miles from the Galilee he'd governed for over 3 decades. He would never come home. And here, right at the end, even the exact place he was sent becomes a small, strange puzzle. because our one great source can't seem to keep the story straight. Part 14. Gaul, or Spain. Here is a genuine crack in the record, and I'd rather show it to you than smooth it over. Josephus tells us about the exile of Antipas twice, in 2 different books, and the 2 accounts don't quite agree. In the Antiquities, he says Caligula banished Antipas to Lugdunum, a city in Gaul, which we would read as Lyon, in what is now France. But in his earlier work, The Jewish War, Josephus writes that Antipas was banished into Spain, and that he died there, and he adds a small human detail that his wife had followed him into exile. Gaul, or Spain. Lyon, or Iberia. Which is it? The likeliest answer, worked out by later historians, is quietly satisfying. There was more than one place in the Roman world called Lugdunum. One was the great city of Lyon in central Gaul, but another, far smaller, sat down in the foothills of the Pyrenees, right on the frontier between Gaul and Spain, a town we'd now call Saint-Bertrand de Comminges. And if that was the Lugdunum Josephus meant, then the puzzle dissolves. It's a border town. One account loosely calls the region Gaul, the other loosely calls it Spain, and both are pointing at the same lonely spot on the edge of the empire, because it sits on the line between the 2. But notice what even the solution leaves us holding. We know he was exiled. We know he died in exile, somewhere out on that western frontier, with Herodias beside him. And that is the end of what we know. We do not have the date of his death. We do not have the manner of it. We do not have a grave. The Tetrarch who beheaded John the Baptist and mocked Jesus at his trial does not die under a divine curse in any record that exists. He fades out in a border town at the far end of the world, stripped of his title, his wife at his side, and then the sources simply let go of him. The same silence that swallowed Pilate, the same silence that swallowed Caiaphas. 3 men, 3 unremarkable ends, a recall, a deposition, an exile, and then, for all 3, the dark. But I owe you one more thing before we close, because there is a Herod in the New Testament who dies a genuinely horrifying death, struck down in the middle of his own glory, and almost everyone who tells the terrible death story pins it on the wrong man. Part 15. The worm that ate the wrong Herod. If you've heard the story that Herod was eaten by worms, here is the thing nobody stops to check. That story is true. It really is in the record, in the book of Acts, and, remarkably, confirmed in its outline by Josephus as well. But the Herod it happened to is not the Herod of the trial. It was the nephew. Herod Agrippa I, the very man who inherited Antipas's kingdom, the charming schemer who talked Caligula out of a crown for himself. In the year 44, Acts tells us, Agrippa appeared at Caesarea in dazzling royal robes and gave a public oration, and the crowd cried out that this was the voice of a god and not a man. And because he took the worship and did not turn it aside, Acts says, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died. And Josephus, independently, describes the same scene, the king in his shining silver garment catching the morning sun, the flatterers hailing him as a god, and then sudden agony seizing him in the belly, 5 days of pain and death. That's where the worms come from. That's the one authentically terrible end in the whole family. And it belongs to a man who wasn't at the trial of Jesus at all, who was, if anything, on the winning side of the family drama, the one who came out ahead. Do you see what's happened over the centuries? The one dramatic death in the historical record gets quietly lifted off the man it actually happened to and reassigned to Pilate, to Antipas, to whichever villain the storyteller needs to punish. The true story of divine reckoning gets stolen from Agrippa, who earned it in the record, and spread over the men we wish had earned it, who in fact just faded away. The tradition didn't lack a terrible death. It had one all along. It simply moved it on to the wrong men, because those were the men it wanted to see fall. And one last small correction. Because it comes up, the image of Pilate driven mad, washing his hands over and over for the rest of his life. That one isn't ancient at all. It's an echo of Shakespeare, of Lady Macbeth and her spot that will not out. A stage image borrowed backward across 1600 years and pinned onto a Roman prefect. Not history, not even old legend. Just a great playwright's ghost wearing Pilate's face. And so we come to the quiet at the centre of it all. 3 men sent Jesus to the cross, in the tellings we inherited, a prefect, a priest, and a tetrarch, and we were handed a story of thunder, of God hunting them down, of suicides and worms and haunted lakes and bodies the earth refused. It's a story that comforts, it balances the ledger, it lets justice have the last word. But when you actually read the record, Josephus, the stone in the theatre, the bone box in the peace forest, the thunder isn't there. What's there instead is smaller and stranger, and I think more honest. A recall notice. A deposition at Passover. An exile order to a town on the edge of the map. And then, over all 3 of them, the same soft total silence, closing like water. History did not punish these men. History did something it does far more often. It simply lost interest and let them go. And maybe that's the thing the pews were never told, and the thing worth sitting with tonight. The need to see them punished says everything about us, and almost nothing about them. We built the worms and the haunted lake and the sainthood and the madness because we could not stand an unfinished sentence, because a silence, to the human heart, is somehow more unbearable than a curse. The wrath we imagined was our wrath. The record just kept its counsel and let the door close. But the door doesn't close on everyone, because there was a 4th figure in that courtyard on the night of the trial, one who was warned, in a dream, to have nothing to do with this righteous man. She has a name in some traditions and a feast day in others, and her story runs in a direction you would never expect. That's where we go next time. The dream of Pilate's wife and what the oldest churches on earth insist really happened to her. Until then, rest well and keep asking the questions they never taught you to ask.